live. Welcome to another episode of Comp and Coffee. I am joined by my usual comrades here, Ruth and Bill. My name's Russ, and of course, we love to talk about compensation and coffee. I got an email from a listener the other day and said you guys talk a lot about compensation. Where's the talk about coffee? So I did want to start us off with a coffee question. It's a little bit of surprise. I did not prepare anyone for this question, so be ready. This is completely off the cuff, no preparation. Bill, how do you like to enjoy your very first cup of coffee for the day? Do you prepare it yourself? If so, how? Do you have a favorite coffee shop you go to? How does that first cup of coffee happen for you in the day, Bill?
Shockingly, I can answer this.
Yes.
And I'm not paid for this answer. Starbucks, typically mild or medium roast, plain, straight up black drip coffee, which I can either make at home or go to Starbucks if I'm out and about somewhere near where there is a Starbucks, which is a lot of places around here. I'm
fascinated by the answer because I like Starbucks mixed drinks, but I find their black coffee, and I do like black coffee, to be too strong. It's better for mixing. But that's an interesting answer. Ruth, what is your preferred way of starting your day with coffee?
With my own espresso machine downstairs in my kitchen, and I make myself a latte coffee with an espresso tab.
Nice. And I have a French press. And just to be completely transparent, I am very much a nerd. So my French press looks like Doctor Who's TARDIS. And so each morning I make a French press for my wife and I.
Is that the phone booth?
Yes, it looks like a police box, technically. Not a phone booth, but a police box, which looks like a phone booth, but it's not that. Yes, and so we like to grind our beans fresh. So my wife and I travel a lot. So part of our hobbies is to find new fresh beans to bring home and then grind and make French press coffee out. So that's the first one of the day. The rest are all K-cups, but the first cup of coffee of the day. So there we are. But what's been interesting as we've been enjoying our coffee, I know many of us like to read the news on our various tablets. I don't know if anybody's, Bill, do you still read a newspaper? I feel like you still might be, as the compensation ombudsman, do you actually still look at paper newspapers?
No, online.
So all digital, yeah. Ruth, you don't use a newspaper anymore either, do you?
No.
Okay,
no.
Yeah. But we're all past that. So anyway, on our favorite digital device, reading the news, and I thought it might be fun. It feels like there's been a ton of news stories in our space lately, just dropping left and right. So I thought it might be kind of fun to kind of ask each of you, what's a news story you've been reading lately that kind of caught your eye in the compensation space? Maybe we can each chat about it a little bit. So let's kick it off with you, Ruth. Ruth, what's a story that recently caught your eye in compensation that you think might be worth dissecting a little bit here?
Well, probably no surprise to the audience who know what my passions are. It was the Netflix story about them stepping back from their open salary policy for directors and executives. I think it happened in December. Because I've followed their story on pay transparency quite closely.
They were passionate about it too for a while, weren't they?
Yeah, they were really one of the poster childs back in 2017, along with people like Buffer and Whole Foods, who were one of the first to lead on pay transparency. And like those other organizations, they made it very much a value-led discussion. When I work with organizations to talk about how to affect pay transparency, I always say it needs to be aligned to your values. And if you're not transparent in any other way in your organization, then trying to suddenly be very open about pay is not going to feel right. But for them, it was part of their ethos, their radical candor ethos. It was all about giving wonderful, honest feedback. And I remember that, their co-chief executive stating, our employees, transparency has become the biggest symbol of how much we trust them to act responsibly. So, they were definitely out there. I think it's an interesting time for them to be hitting the headline, because if you think about how 2022 was really the year of pay transparency, and we saw many employers really starting to focus and knuckle down to think about how they were going to address pay transparency in their organizations, mainly in relation to responding to the US state and metro legislation around disclosing pay ranges in job postings. So an interesting time to see them pulling back. I mean, I think it's an interesting case study to probably follow, because they're obviously going through their own challenges, different changing competitive environment. When they were introduced the pay transparency, it was kind of the boom time for them. Everyone was winning. That's now not the case for them. So is there a lesson to be learned here about, how do you make transparency stick, and how do you make it work consistently, whether everybody's winning or, you're going through harder times? I don't know. What did you guys think about when you saw that story?
Yeah, Bill, what was your reaction? Because it's not sort of a pay transparency is not sort of a fair weather thing. You don't just turn it on and off here easily. What was your reaction, Bill, to this story?
I think it's super interesting. It also caught my eye. And it's interesting. It's not because, as Netflix goes, so goes the rest of the corporate world. It's more that Netflix was so far ahead of the curve on things like transparency, and they're sort of at, or in reality probably well beyond what most companies are aiming for today. So the fact that they're pulling back is noteworthy. And as a side note, I'd say it'll be interesting to see how they manage it, because Ruth was hitting a few key points here. It's like it was a very big visible part of their corporate culture. And now they're saying, we're not doing that, we're not doing that as much. And so there's a whole communication aspect to this, is how do you make that kind of change without ruining your culture, or without, disengaging your employees. But I think it's interesting because it also shows that transparency is hard. It's easy to say we want to be transparent, or, in many cases, it's easy for people and employees and outsiders to say companies should be more transparent, but it's hard to do. And there is no, universal definition of pay transparency and what exactly that means, but it's a lot more than just sharing information. And I think that the problem, and if you read between the lines, you don't have to drill too hard, is one of the problems is, as companies get bigger and become more, I would say, corporate, whatever that means. I think you can probably intuit from that what I'm getting at, but like sharing information with people the employees start using that against the company. People start negotiating and saying, why am I paid this? And that person who doesn't do as much as I do, or doesn't work as well, or doesn't rate as highly as me, why do they get paid more? And so you start having all of these conversations, and without the employees not knowing how all these decisions are made, what all the factors are, what are all the skills that are going into the pay decisions for somebody's pay, it's a lot harder for transparency to be a positive thing. And so, I don't have inside information on what's going on at Netflix, but they did say they're sort of raising the level of who can see that information. Yeah. And I think it'll be interesting to see how they do it. And, I think the takeaway for the audience here is just posting information is not it's not a cure-all. And you're going to need to do a lot of work to make that information make sense and make people process and understand it.
Yeah, the thing that jumped out at me on this article, and this is the part, everything you said, Bill, makes total sense. And I think the complexity of pay transparency, I think any company who starts down this road and sees a bunch of challenges with it and pulls back makes a lot of sense. The part about the article that jumped out at me, though, that I kind of looked at, it was kind of like, wait a minute, was, the opening sort of paragraph here, they're sort of like, part of the headline is they're stepping back from the open salary policy for directors and execs, which implies that it's still open salary information for everyone else. So it's okay for thee, but not for me, right? It's almost like, to me, that's more potentially culturally damaging than saying, you know what, open salaries is really complicated. It's harder than we thought. We're going to turn all this off for now, and we're going to rethink it. But kind of creating a protected class where everyone else's salaries are transparent, I think that adds complexity to this, and I'm really curious to see what happens there as they try to move forward with these changes.
It's funny. I hear what you're saying. I didn't read it that way. Maybe it's my exec comp background because, a public companies, at least the top 5 execs are, it's very transparent what they're paid. Although,
right.
I have a whole other podcast on how full disclosure can be completely confusing and make no sense to people, like,
right.
The proxy guidelines. But yeah, that would be a weird, a cultural change, I think, to have a class system where I can see your salary but you can't see mine.
Interesting. Well, great pick, Ruth. That's a good one. I'm gonna keep an eye on that one. Bill, what story caught your eye in recent weeks?
Not exactly a compensation story, but the idea that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is proposing regulations that would effectively ban normal non-competes for most employees at most companies in the U.S. Sorry, Ruth. It is sort of a technical government thing here, but I think that this has sort of been percolating around. The whole idea of non-competes has changed over time. It went from being a relatively rare thing for high-level executives and, people like Coke who knew the formula, that kind of thing. And then it's, sort of moved to mainstream, a lot of employees, a lot of companies, and now, something like a third of American employees have some kind of non-compete where they can't quit their job and go to a quote unquote competitor, however that's defined in their individual agreement. And, and it goes way down to, hourly workers, not particularly skilled, not particularly known, knowledgeable of, company secrets. And I think it's interesting that it's coming from the Federal Trade Commission, although if you step back and think about it, it is about restraint of trade, me trading, on my personal employment. And it's, the non-competes restrict where I can go to work and how long I have to wait before I can go to a competitor. And it's questioning sort of the fairness, the legitimacy, and, whether or not that's like an undue restraint on people's ability to move. And, maybe I'll let, Russ or Ruth, if you want to jump in. I can keep going, but it's not the Bill show.
Yeah. Well, Ruth, I wanted to ask your reaction to this. I feel like Europe's a little different than the US when it comes to non-competes.
Yeah, I think we've had the position where non-competes have started to become increasingly unenforceable over here. So, people are more focusing on other methods within employment contracts, like using IP clauses or non-disclosure agreements or trade secret law, to do the things that you actually want these things to do. I read it, it surprised me, the $300 billion price tag that they were saying, they felt wages were being suppressed by. It seems like phenomenally large. And, when I look at the US labor market last year and how dynamic and buoyant and how much wage inflation we saw, that doesn't look like a market that was stifled by non-compete clauses. But I think we should definitely address if there are employee segments where these are just kind of being blanket applied that it is not relevant for. So, maybe having a threshold of pay or a level in an organization, because if there are lower wage workers who are just kind of having these non-competes, enforced on them for no real good reason, then that doesn't seem to make sense. And it's another way that we're penalizing kind of employees at the lower end of the organization.
Yeah. Bill, I'm curious about the number too. I caught the number two, Ruth, that they mentioned about pay suppression. But what rings sort of, I don't know, inflated about that number, I guess, is, and I'm not a fan of non-competes, by the way. I just thought that was an interesting number because, Bill, aren't non-competes already illegal in some states? Like, isn't it effectively unenforceable in at least a few states?
Yes. California and Massachusetts are two. California, it's been.
So basically, Silicon Valley, there is no such thing as a
right.
non-compete in Silicon Valley.
Right. And if you've like worked with companies in Silicon Valley, or, even just followed the news, it's like people jump from,
right.
from Google to Facebook and Facebook to Google, and, and back and forth,
Apple, right.
all over the place. And, I think people there would say, take both sides of the argument, actually, that it's, it helps innovation because everybody gets better. And I think, and also, like, as an employer, you hate the fact that your employee can just up and leave and go. You worked on like a search engine at Yahoo, and then you moved to Google, and it's sort of like, wait, that, you went to my direct competitor, and it hurts me and it helps them. So I do think it's fairly interesting, but those companies seem to do okay overall. I think the more interesting part is when people leave bigger companies to start their own company. Because there is this common belief that innovation doesn't come from the industry leader. And don't write in, that's not always true, but that small nimble startups can do things and take risks that bigger companies with established client bases can't. And so if to the extent that you're prohibited from going off and starting your own business, or going to work for a smaller company that's doing something, more interesting, more innovative, that can hurt you. The 300 billion, was that the number?
Yeah,
I didn't quite understand where that came from. And those sort of numbers, I'm a math guy, and I just like, it's too many zeros, and like, it's hard to process what that really means. But I do think, if you just think, say, a television news producer, has a lot of skills, and the place where you would go and take your skills and your experience and your knowledge and get the most money for that would be at another network or another, avenues news program, like right. The direct competitor. Like, that's where you're most valuable. But, with some of these non-competes, and it depends on the language, and also the aggressiveness of the enforcement of the employer. And I think, a lot of people know what I'm getting at there is you have some companies that are, it's a pretty big stick that they hit you with if you are going to go, and they, make examples out of people so that everyone's like, I'm not going to even bother. And I think that's where you find that the non-competes can actually stifle movement and stifle, pay opportunity. That's where you're losing the money, is where you could, when you can't use the most leverage that you've got. But
it's interesting, isn't it, that, at where what you often see particularly at the senior level, people negotiating so that they're paid out or they're bought out, by their, the employer they're leaving or the employer they're going to. So those people end up being protected. And it may be that, the lower level workers who are faced with these non-competes, who then, aren't in that privileged position where they're going to be protected right. going on to their new employer, right. Which, is quite frustrating. I mean, it's interesting here in the UK, we have, this wonderful concept of gardening leave, where, you'll get put on gardening leave because effectively our notice periods are contractual and paid out. So the concept of me putting on a nice dress and picking up my pruning shears and going to tend my roses for 6 months, making sure that I'm not, starting another HR tech company. But that seems to work, and that is become much more common practice than enforcing non-compete clauses over my side of the pond.
Right. And I think there would be a lot less objection if that's the way it was handled here. But here it's that there's this
you're being compensated. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, if you want to keep someone out of the hands of the competition, you have to pay them for that time period. Is sort of the
right.
Imagine if there were non-competes in professional sports. Like, hey, hey, Tom Brady, you can't go play for the Bucks now. That's not really how that would work.
Well, and I think Ruth, at the beginning of this, Ruth made a comment that I think I want to underscore that there are other things that protect the company.
Yeah.
That you can't share secrets. It doesn't matter whether you have a non-compete or not. And that's really the kind of protection you want. Although, if I'm being honest, and I'm on both sides of the non-compete argument, it's like, it sucks when it applies to me, but it's great, when I'm the employer.
When you're the COO, right?
let's just be clear about that.
Right.
There are some subtle things that happen when your employees go to work for a competitor, and that one of your worst fears as an employer losing an employee to a competitor is now you have an employee who says, "Oh, I used to work there, and now I work here, and this place is much better." And I have, I have that reference point where I can say, I used to work there. I used to sell that product. I used to support it, and here are all the problems. And so it's, and I think there's a lot of, you have to be very careful if you're going to do those kinds of things, but that is a big risk. And that's, one of the reasons you don't want people going to a direct competitor immediately after working at my company. But at the end of the day, it seems like companies are, in places like California have been able to do okay and survive. But whether or not the FTC has the power to do this, I mean, it does seem like it's unclear, but it does seem like the trend is going toward weakening these non-competes. And it's probably because, businesses, corporations have gotten a little bit too greedy, and, there's too much leveraging, the disconnect between power of the employer versus power of the employee, especially on, I think that the original FTC case is about security guards, believe it or not.
Well, I kind of wonder if it's sort of like, we've talked about this with pay transparency a little bit, where right now there's all these little individual pay transparency laws popping up all across the country. And it's getting to the point where a lot of folks are saying, we should just have a federal rule about this. This sort of feels like that. There's so many states and areas that are now either completely against, this law is completely forbidding non-competes, or makes them technically unenforceable and just creates a frivolous law because it doesn't really happen. The FTC could just be like, let's just call this whole thing off because it doesn't really work anyway. And let's just save everybody all the time, money, aggravation, and paper printing these things out, and just call it done. So it's probably something like that, and also worker fairness, but we'll see what happens. That's coming.
Yeah. And it's, it's great to have one law that covers everybody.
Right.
It's more typical coming from Congress.
Yeah, you'd think it would be Congress, though, right? These agencies are getting excited. Yeah, exactly. It just feels like that's how it should go. But anyway, who knows? All right. Well, I also, a couple of stories caught my eye, and the reason this one caught my eye is I mentioned at the top of the show, I'm a little bit of a nerd. I'm a science fiction and fantasy nerd. I'm also a Disney nerd. Huge fan of Disney. Why
does that not surprise me?
See, it shouldn't surprise you. Both as a fan, just as a fan of their work and their theme parks and everything, but also as a professional, I've always been in Walt Disney is one of my sort of historical figures that I learned a lot from and read a lot about in college. And I like Disney's HR practices, generally speaking. I think they do a lot of, they're sort of an exemplar in a lot of ways, historically, for a lot of interesting things around onboarding, corporate culture. How do you handle a huge amount of employees in one location, being the largest single site employer on the planet, things like that. So it's a really fascinating company to watch. And so I'm always kind of keeping an eye on them and watching for them in the news. And to set this up, so there was recent news in our space from Disney, from their new CEO, who is their old CEO, Bob Iger. So for those who haven't been following the Walt Disney Company, right in the round of 2020 during COVID, which obviously had a huge impact on them, both in the movie side, theaters, as well as their theme parks. Bob Iger was getting ready to step down anyway. He was the CEO of Disney during one of their golden times when they acquired Star Wars, really built up their theme parks. A lot of things happened under Bob Iger. So anyway, Bob Iger stepped down and Bob Chapek took over in mid 2020, and he's been running the company, and he's been whether it's his fault or not, there's been a lot of headwinds against Disney in that time period. A bunch of stuff in politics, a bunch of stuff where obviously COVID was a huge problem. Their movies haven't been doing very well, with possible exception of, the Wakanda movies. So Bob's back. So Bob Iger's back. So Bob Iger just in December came back in. And when new leaders, or old leaders, I guess, when a new leader steps in, they usually like to observe for a little while and then start doing a bunch of small but impactful things to start to, kind of remind the company there's a new sheriff in town and here's how I'm going to be different. And given that Bob Iger was a former CEO not that long ago and he's back, he didn't really wait around long to start doing things. And one of the things he just came out literally last week, he announced that hybrid employees at the Walt Disney Company now must return to the office at least 4 days a week starting March 1st. Now, what caught my eye about this story was, one, obviously, we talk a lot about remote work here, and in thought leadership, Ruth and I do a lot of presentations on this, and we're obviously very fascinated about the move to it. It obviously has a huge impact on compensation, how we think about compensation. But what's interesting about this article in particular, the one I happened to see was in NPR, the headline was sort of, it's also the way the email from Bob Iger read, it was sort of the way they positioned it was sort of being a case study in corporate culture, marrying to business policy. And the statement that Iger had in there was, as a creative business, nothing can replace the ability to connect, observe, and create with peers. That comes from being physically together, nor the opportunity to grow professionally by learning from leaders and mentors. So that was sort of Iger's founding statement. And then he went on to say, so I think we need to all be in person at least 4 days a week. So he's really tying the ability to be creative and the creative energy that he claims defines Disney and Disney's corporate culture. It's an essential part of doing that. And so this is his positioning for why he, like several other big, well-known CEOs, are now saying, hey, there is a need to be in person. And for Disney, it is 4 days a week minimum. What's your guys' reaction to this? I mean, it does come on the tails of a lot of other big CEOs coming out there saying, hey, you got to get back in person as well. Is this really any different than anybody else's thing? What do we feel about this? Ruth, what's your reaction to the statement from Disney?
Well, it's one of those where I start to see steam coming out my ears. I mean, he's not alone, obviously. There's a whole load of other business leaders, Apple mandating employees come back to work 3 days a week in September last year. And of course, Elon Musk, need we say more about, his challenges with the Twitter employees. It's also Davos this week, World Economic Forum, business leaders, gathering in Davos. And it was a topic of conversation yesterday that hit the headlines last night, actually. The head of Citigroup there talked about the challenges of managing a hybrid workers and ensuring productivity. She talked about getting employees back into the office to put them through a productivity camp before they kind of let them go back to hybrid. Because Larry Fink's in Davos, no surprise. And, he reinforced his views that remote working does not work. He's been quite public speaking about that. I think there's even one other commentator who said, we're now having to communicate with employees through Instagram because they don't read their emails, which I just thought was totally bizarre. But anyway, slightly taking us off track. My feeling on this is that we need to learn to adapt. I do not think, hybrid remote working is going away anytime soon. And as business leaders, we need to learn new ways of managing employees in a remote environment so that we can ensure things like problem solving, collaboration, which, Bob Iger was talking about, creativity, onboarding new hires happens effectively. I got into a debate on LinkedIn with our wonderful non-exec Paul Wolf, who was leader of HR at Indeed. He's now one of our non-execs. He started an excellent discussion on LinkedIn about, basically saying, bringing people back into the office is not the way to reinforce corporate culture. A physical office is not your corporate culture. It's the way you act. It's the way that you treat your employees. It's the way you respect your employees. It's the way you interact with your employees. So I just think it's part of this adapting, transitioning future of work that we've got to find a way to make it work. And we are going through a transition, and it will still take some more time to play out. That's my view anyway.
Yeah, good stuff. Bill, what was your reaction to this one?
Well, my reaction is always the same, and slightly different from Ruth's. But I guess that's what good debate is about. I do think like the blended workforce is a challenge. When you and Ruth mentioned Elon Musk, and when he basically said that the Twitter white collar workers needed to come into the office because the manufacturing people were coming to the plant every day, and it just wasn't fair. And you have that sort of issue. That is not, to Ruth's point, not the only way to solve that problem, but that there is that mindset of the haves and the have-nots there. But there are a lot of differences between the office workers and the plant workers, and there are different things you can do. But I do think that in the early days of COVID, there was a lot of people overlooked a lot of the things that stopped happening when people stopped going into the office. And I think what Disney is looking at is a very innovative, collaborative, idea-oriented organization, and that in-person interactions, we haven't figured out how to replicate those in-person interactions with a mostly or completely remote workforce. And that these Zoom calls or whatever these video conferencing capabilities allow you to see. Their conference calls where you can see people, but it's not the same as the what I'd call the accidental interactions where you run into people. And I think what's missing and what needs to be replicated, which I'm sure can be replicated in a remote sort of technologically driven interaction, but we're not even close to it now. What needs to happen is the people you don't have daily or weekly meetings with, you need to have a way to run into them, to interact with them, both from an idea perspective, because you get more interesting ideas from people that you don't work with every day, because they see things differently and have different exposures. But also you build a stronger culture or connection. And I think it's true, like your culture is not being in the office, but your culture benefits from being in person at some point in time. And I think, we have a lot of like free agent kind of employees now, and lots of companies have people that have never met any of their coworkers in person. And those people have no way of like really knowing who else they should be talking to about things, who else in the organization knows things that would be useful. And so I think the way we're doing remote now reinforces silos, and that's creating problems. And it's a deferred problem. And we're not going to see the sort of the pain and the downside of that for we're starting to see it now, and we'll see more of it later. Hopefully the technology and the approach to remote work will get better and stem the problem.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I wonder if that's sort of the angle that some of these CEOs are seeing, which is they know there might be a talent competition problem if they do force people to come in, but they also know what they're getting, though. They know that there's going to be some upside because the things that we're pushing down the road, which Disney thinks is creativity, is something we can't live without. One thing I think you brought up, this is what jumped out at me, Bill. You mentioned the hybrid workforce, meaning or mixed workforce. When you're a company, I think one of the things that gets left on the floor in the conversation a lot when we talk about remote work is oftentimes we go immediately in our head to white collar workers. So of course they should be 100% remote, but these companies that have mixed divisions that must be on site, right? Disney's theme parks must be on site. The manufacturing, the Imagineers, all those guys building all this stuff must be on site. it becomes a sort of a complicated hospitals, healthcare, right? Must be on site. Can you say the doctors and nurses have to be on site, but the managers and the finance people don't because they don't work on patient, like they work with patients? I mean, you can say that, and many hospitals do that, but it becomes sort of this have and have not situation. And yet the people doing the work on site oftentimes are the reason the company even can exist, right? You can't have a hospital without doctors and nurses. The theme park division doesn't work without the theme parks, so there is this sort of a balancing act you have to do. And the other thing I think about is just a Disney fan. I think about, as I've watched a lot of historic footage of how the animators work and how the Imagineers work, and there's all these shots, and obviously many of them are staged, but how they're sitting together in a room and brainstorming, and there's all these great stories if you're reading the biographies about, I had this crazy idea and it was terrible, it wasn't going to work, and then Walt walked by and said this, and it changed my entire outlook. You don't get the Walt walk by part, that's what's missing. And there's all these anecdotes, and maybe they're exaggerated at Disney, but I bet there's enough of them where someone like Niagara looks around and goes, we're missing that. We're missing, and it's a big deal that we're missing that, right? And I don't know if that applies to every company, but there's something there. And I think you're right, Ruth. There's a way to fix this remotely, and maybe it's not 4 days a week, but there's some balance that we have not hit yet. And I think the pendulum's going to swing back and forth and overcorrect until we figure out what it is. And I don't know that anybody's really solved it yet, but I think it's what we're seeing now. Is we know we're missing something, as you pointed out, Bill, but we don't know how to fix it yet in a way that's fair and effective, if that makes sense.
Yes. And I think, it's funny because I'm just thinking about these issues that, like the Disney issue and the Netflix issue that we just talked about.
Yeah.
They're really interesting, and they, create a good conversation. But, like I said, Netflix is not the barometer of all companies. Disney can probably get away with doing this because of their culture, and that people like you, Russ, love Disney, and, people who work there love the organization. I'm sure there are some that don't, but in general, it's a place people like to work. And so they have probably, I'm just guessing, less risk of, losing masses of people by forcing people to come back. And similarly, Bob Iger is a very well-respected CEO and, former Disney CEO and current Disney CEO. And so he himself, I think, has more latitude to make these kinds of decrees and not have as much backlash as any of us would if we did it at our companies and said, you have to be here 4 days a week starting tomorrow, next week or whatever. And so I think, like Disney and Bob Iger can probably do this more easily than a lot of other companies could. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But I think, you've got to be careful when you make these decisions of how it impacts your employees, how it impacts your organization. And, are the positives more valuable than the negatives? Yeah.
Agreed. Any final thoughts, Ruth, before we sign off today? I know we any other thoughts on the Disney or any other on the articles?
No, I mean, I just underline the point that both of you made about mixed workforces. I think I went away to kind of look at the figure because I get very frustrated with the headlines, our obsession with remote and hybrid work. And when I looked at it, it was like 37% of the US workforce are knowledge workers. The rest of everybody, really has to go to work. So we need to think about that. But no, I think 3 interesting stories. There was a lot in the news last week, really. And those, it was quite easy to pick some meaty stories for us to talk about.
Yeah. So there you have it. That's what we think about what's been in the news lately. What do you guys think about it? And by the way, if you see an article and you're like, man, I wish the folks on Comp and Coffee would talk about that, send it on over. We'll take a look and maybe talk about it on a future episode. So to do that, just send us an email at coffee@payscale.com or tweet us over at Payscale. And thanks for listening to Comp and Coffee. Comp and Coffee is a Payscale production dedicated to the compensation community. We welcome your feedback. send email to coffee@payscale.com, tweet us at Payscale, or share your thoughts in our Payscale Connect community. Until next time, keep your coffee hot and your data fresh.